are struggling and are reaching breaking point. From a food security perspective, WFP is extremely concerned because we need to be able to scale an operation almost at an industrial level, but because of issues of access, insecurity, it's extraordinarily difficult to do so. Much of the country we do not have the levels of access to that we require. WFP has incurred significant losses at the front end of the emergency when warehouses and offices were looted. We've been playing catch up ever since. And although we have good engagement with all sides to the conflict, we simply are not able to do what is required. And if this continues, I'm extremely concerned about what's going to happen. We already have the largest displacement crisis in Sudan. IOM has recently issued figures that suggest almost 10 million people have been displaced, and what we're seeing is increasingly people crossing borders, be it either into South Sudan, into Chad, into Egypt and others, where they no longer have confidence that they're going to be able to meet their needs inside the country, that the humanitarian actors will not be able to reach them, so they are taking decisions with their feet, and they are bringing their families and what little items they have across borders. I was in Port Sudan last week, Mel, and conversations with refugees are absolutely heartbreaking. I met a teacher, his name was Omar. He'd just arrived, having walked for 6 days with his 6 children from El Obeid, and he was coming because he had lost hope that he would be able to provide a future, and particularly an education for his children. And yet what we know is once they arrive, there's limited ability for the humanitarian actors to respond in a sustained manner. And we know that in the transit centres, malnutrition rates are rising because of that combination of hunger, displacement and disease. So today we're asking for a number of key requests. The first is there needs to be an end to the conflict. Absolutely essential. We will not, as humanitarians, be able to meet the needs without an end to the conflict. Then we need to have access. We need access throughout the country. Eddie will tell you shortly that we are only reaching about 10% of the acutely hungry in the country at the moment because of that lack of access that I've referred to. Then we need to have a political solution. Without that, again, we will not be able to see how Sudan can be put back together again. And then finally, from WFP's perspective, we need increased funding. This all comes with considerable cost. This is an expensive operation because of the complexities involved. And it's complex inside Sudan, it's complex in South Sudan and all of the neighbouring countries. So thank you very much for your time this afternoon. And am I handing over to Eddie or are you? Okay, excellent. Thanks so much.
Thank you very much, Michael, and good afternoon to the media and our colleagues. As Michael has just alluded, the food security situation in Sudan is very dire. The projections from the revised IPC, which was done just last month, indicate close to 18 million people who are acutely food insecure. This is an upwards revision of the projected 15 million that was anticipated during the revised IPC. Now, if we do not have an immediate cessation of hostilities, the food security or hunger crisis in Sudan would further deteriorate, particularly so as we approach the hunger season, which starts in May. Now, prior to the conflict, Sudan was already facing perhaps one of the world's most protracted crises, a crisis of hunger and if we continue in 2024, we would be on the verge of an all-out humanitarian disaster. Now, of the nearly 18 million people facing acute food insecurity, close to 5 million are on the precipice of catastrophe. Now, this lethal cocktail of continued conflict, poor harvests, and rampant and consistent displacement of people risks millions more to plunge into a catastrophic humanitarian disaster. As the regional director alluded to, the IOM revised figures suggest 10.7 million people have been displaced since the conflict broke out in April, within the borders of Sudan and also outside of Sudan. Now, this is very significant. For those who've been following the trend globally, this is perhaps the largest displacement crisis in the globe. The continuous impact of mass displacement is compounded by poor agricultural production, with FAO now projecting that production or this year's harvest would be significantly lower than the 5-year average, not to talk of last year. In other words, we would be seeing anything between 25 to 30% reduction in crop production this year. And what is even critical is the fact that the Eastern Corridor, which is perhaps the breadbasket of Sudan, where we do have some relative safe and security, unfortunately, one of the states, Jazeera State, which perhaps produces half of the grains, particularly wheat, in Sudan, which was attacked in December, right in the middle of the winter crop season, spells disaster. Because what it means is that thousands of smallholder farmers and even the large-scale schemes have been deserted because people are on the move, running away from the conflict. On top of this, and to make matters worse, the Sudanese people have witnessed astronomical inflation in 2023. The economic situation in the country is close to collapse. IMF suggests that we have now, towards the end of 2023, a 300% inflation. And we have been seeing this even in our monthly local food basket and our market monitoring, where now we've just analyzed that compared to last year of the same time, we are seeing an increase of 90% of the local food basket. And I can tell you that less than 5% of Sudanese at this point in time can afford a square meal a day. We continue to see intractable conflict lines, which in fact pose serious constraints to our ability to access communities, particularly in hard-to-reach areas. We are very much concerned on the safety and security of aid workers, as well as safe passages and corridors for us to deliver assistance. But despite the plethora of challenges that we face, the World Food Programme remains very steadfast and committed to deliver life-saving assistance to the very many most vulnerable people in the country. In 2023, the World Food Programme delivered and assisted 6.2 million people across the country. The provision of in-kind food and, in some cases, cash transfers allows us to target at least over 10% of the total number of people who desperately need assistance. In the past year, WFP and our sister agencies made some progress in establishing cross-border operations. With the establishment of the cross-border hub in Chad, particularly in Fachana, the World Food Programme was able to move 11 convoys consisting of 232 trucks carrying 7,500 metric tons to reach nearly 900,000 people in West and Central Darfur. This was considered a major breakthrough as we were able to reach some of the most hard-to-reach locations in the Darfurs. Sadly, we are now faced with a major challenge as we engage with the authorities who have restricted the Chad cross-border operation. WFP, the humanitarian coordinator, and OCHA are engaging with the authorities to ensure that this lifeline, which would allow us to reach many more than just West and Central Darfur, would remain operational and that we would be able to provide the much needed assistance to those who desperately need it. At this moment, the food security of millions in the Darfur regions, in the Kordofans, is in severe jeopardy, and we hope that we would have a very positive outcome on the engagement with the authorities for us to be able to sustain the cross-border operation. Seemingly, as a result of the attack in Al Jazeera State and the consequential evacuation and relocation of aid workers, we are also engaging with the government for the establishment of another cross-border operation through South Sudan, which would allow us to reach the Kordofans as well as East and South Darfur. We've been struggling throughout last year to reach the Kordofans, particularly West Kordofan. Establishing a cross-border operation from South Sudan would allow us to reach over 1 million people in the Kordofans as well as in East and South Darfur. I would stop here and hopefully would be prepared to respond to comments or questions. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Eddie, and good afternoon, everyone in the room and online. As Michael said, I'm Muriel McGroarty. I'm the Country Director for the World Food Programme in South Sudan. The human tragedy and the humanitarian consequences of the war in Sudan is spilling over to the neighbouring countries, and South Sudan is one of those countries. Since April last year, when the war broke out, we have welcomed, and the South Sudanese authorities have welcomed, over 560,000 people to a country of a population of 12.5 million. So that's a huge, huge number of people. Initially, we have seen it was South Sudanese returning back to South Sudan, as Sudan, and the links between both countries are for decades, and it provided a refuge for many South Sudanese. So they were coming back home, many of them first, second, third generation. In the last couple of months, as the conflict has escalated towards the south of the Sudan, we've seen a greater number of refugees, Sudanese nationals, who have walked for days and weeks and who have moved around the country, losing all hope in Sudan and crossing the border to South Sudan. South Sudan is one of the poorest countries on the continent of Africa, the newest nation, independence in 2011. Today, almost 2/3 of the population are in need of humanitarian assistance in South Sudan. There are 7.1 million people acutely food insecure, and we estimate 1.6 million children become malnourished on an annual basis, and particularly this year. That's all driven by conflict, economic shock, and climate change. In the last couple of years, we have seen unprecedented flooding in South Sudan. A lot of that flooding is in the northern part of the country. The northern part of the country is what abuts Sudan. It's the northern part of the country where most of these people are coming through. There's about 14 different entry points. Renk Joda is a primary entry point where we've seen about 90% of the people coming across the border, and coming every single day since the 9th of April last year. It has been relentless for the teams there. The response is to try and move people on from the border, to move South Sudanese back to their communities, and to move the refugees onto established camps. There is a challenge with onward transport because Renk Joda is one of the remotest parts in South Sudan, and South Sudan is sadly a country that has a huge deficit in infrastructure and roads. So it's difficult to get people out of there, and it's difficult to mount a response there. So what we're seeing over the months is congestion in Renk. We're seeing the transit centres that were built for about 6,000 people now accommodating anywhere from 12,000 to 15,000 people, and many more thousands of people remaining in the town of Renk within the communities. Over the last months, we are seeing the nutrition outcomes, the health outcomes begin to deteriorate, and the food security outcomes begin to deteriorate. The humanitarian community is responding in South Sudan, but the response is a transitory response in the hope that people trying to move people on. WFP is providing high energy biscuits, humanitarian support and food support, but it's wholly not enough in terms of where we are today in the crisis in Sudan and the consequences of that war. People are staying longer in Renk. The population that we're seeing now is coming from Khartoum. They don't want to move onwards because many of them are going into areas that are highly food insecure in South Sudan. So we're seeing congestion, we're seeing poor health outcomes, poor nutrition outcomes, and decreasing food security. And we're extremely worried because we're looking into, again, the rainy season in South Sudan, which will make that response much, much more difficult. And as the situation in Sudan around the escalation in the war and the deteriorating food security situation mounts, we can only expect more and more people to come towards South Sudan. So that's the people from Sudan part of it. But there's also another impact that we are seeing in South Sudan. As I said, we have 7.1 million people food insecure, acutely food insecure, who are unable to feed themselves and their family on a consistent basis, on a daily basis. Most of the food insecurity is in that upper belt of the country. The markets from Sudan, those areas were wholly dependent on the markets from Sudan. And once the conflict broke out last year, those markets became completely disrupted. So we've seen an increase in prices of 40 to 50% in basic commodities. These are people who spend 70 to 80% of any income they have on food. So a small price increase means that they're completely unable to afford anymore. So you can imagine what a 40% price increase is in sorghum, the basic. Prices in fuel have also increased. For WFP alone, normally we would buy sorghum in Sudan for our programs. And if anybody knows South Sudan, there are some huge displacement populations who totally depend on the World Food Programme for the food. And we would buy the food from Sudan. Now, because we have to re-engineer our supply chain and come up from the south, it's costing us anywhere between $100 and $150 more a tonne for that food that we are bringing in. So as this conflict continues, the impact on the people themselves of Sudan, but also on the most food insecure in South Sudan, continues to escalate and it continues to deteriorate. And as I said, the rainy season is just around the corner. And it's just, I remember last year in the rainy season what it looked like in Renk. And as a humanitarian of over 25 years, to look at that situation and think, is this the best we can do? Because there is nothing you can do when, you know, roads are cut off and it's just a quagmire. And looking into that and knowing that that's just a few months away, it's heartbreaking. Michael and I were in Renk last week just, talking to women with young children who've walked for weeks, you know, to try and escape the violence and the war. It's just heartbreaking, and you ask yourself why. Really, should this be continuing? Talking to youth who were in university in Khartoum, who are now sitting in Maban refugee camp with no internet, no electricity, their hopes, their dreams squashed. You think, is this going to continue, and how much longer is it going to continue? And most certainly for the people, the cessation, the fighting must stop, and some sense must be brought back to Sudan, because I think the consequences for South Sudan, for Sudan, are just unimaginable. Thank you.
Thank you, Ariane. So we'll go to open up the questions now.
Do we want to go to coffee and chat?
Of course.
Yeah.
Thank you. Coffee was here first. Apologies. So, Coffee, we have you online. There we go. And I'm just going to unmute you here.
Yeah. Good afternoon.
Perfect.
I'm going to turn off the camera because of connectivity issue in Chad. Thank you for the opportunity to talk about the situation in Chad, about the Sudan crisis. As my colleague already said, the situation is really very difficult in Chad as well. As you already know, since the beginning of the crisis, more than 50,000 refugees, Sudanese refugees, have crossed the border to seek refuge in Chad. Before this crisis, Chad was already hosting more than 410,000 Sudanese refugees from the previous crisis in 2022 and 23. So as of today, Chad is hosting more than 1.1 million refugees, including the Sudanese refugees, but also refugees from Central African Republic, from Cameroon and Nigeria. We have been assisting these refugees since the beginning of the crisis, but it's not an easy job because basically of the funding situation. We do not have a clear planning because of the funding resources which is not the country. since the beginning of the year, most of the older refugees from Cameroon and Southern Africa Republic, but also from Nigeria have not received any assistance in the beginning of the year. And for the new refugees, for the FPV, we do not know if we are going to continue to provide them with the assistance they need. This is for the refugees. But when we talk about the food and nutrition situation in Chad, it is also very difficult. Based on the Cadre results of November 2023, there will be 2.9 million Chadian population will be faced acute food security and nutrition crisis during the rainy season. As my colleague already said, the rainy season is coming and we need to prepare some food now if we want to be able to assist these refugees, but also the Chadian population who is affected by food insecurity during the rainy season. The government has declared an emergency food and nutrition situation emergency since 15th of February, and is calling for support because Chad cannot face alone this situation, and we do not understand why since the beginning we are not receiving the support and funding that we need to provide the critical humanitarian assistance to this population, both the refugee, the returnees, and the vulnerable host population. We will need for the next season 224 million to be able to continue the assistance, both for the refugees and for on the other category of Sudanese and the other category of refugees, Cameroonian, Nigerian, and Central Africa Republic. And we do not have this yet. And I will join my colleagues to pledge for this mobilization so that we can be able to continue providing critical assistance to this population. And when you are asked to this, as in Sudan, South Sudan as well, we are facing a high inflation rate because of the food deficit, but also the increase in oil price in Chad. Actually, we are facing a critical situation because there is a strike from Cameroon for transporters, and in Chad also they have declared they are striking about to protest against the increase of oil prices. So the situation is very, very, very tough in Chad as well. And when you add it to that we are in political transition, we do not know yet how the situation will also evolve from political side.
Thanks, Kofi. I think, Kofi, maybe that's a good place to stop and we can take some questions now.
Yeah, thank you, Kofi. And I'm going to just start opening up the floor to questions. I see there's already a hand up. I'll just ask, so I'll turn your mic and your camera on. If you could just introduce yourself with your name and the organization you represent, and if you want to direct the question to someone in specific, then let's do that. So I'll open it up here to our first hand up, which is Bahira. So you should be able to turn your mic and your camera on now, Bahira, if you can, and go ahead and ask your question. Not too well. You got to get your volume up if you can. Speak closer to the mic if possible. I'll try and get our volume up, but I think it might be on your end, because we had Kofi all right, but you're pretty quiet.
Okay, I'll just put it in your phone.
You can try and ask it, and we'll try and parse it.
Okay, so I'm going to ask two related questions, because first Mr. Rose said that 5 million people in Sudan are on the precipice of catastrophe. So I'd like to ask what that means for a non-specialist audience. What physical state are 5 million people in? And related to that, we've been hearing a lot on looming famine, impending famine. At what point are we in a famine? And how close are we currently to that point? How long do we have?
Okay, turn it to Eddie first. I'll just give you the mics here.
What's the name?
From AFP.
Oh, thank you very much. Indeed, in a layman's term, 5 million people on the precipice of catastrophe is simply a reflection of our integrated phase classification on food security, which categorizes food insecurity from 1 to 5. And at the moment, we have category 4, which is an emergency situation where individuals would find it difficult to afford a meal a day. And obviously, after category 4 or phase 4, the final stage is phase 5, which is famine. And to answer to your question on famine, there are set procedures for a declaration of famine in any given context. Not least, we need to have the data and the evidence which would subscribe to all the conditions that would merit a declaration of famine. So far, we are collecting the data to ensure we have the evidence. And again, there are challenges given that even on the data collection, access is a major impediment. But we hope that we would have a statistical representation of the data that would inform us of the evidence to substantiate the food insecurity levels in Sudan. And we hope to do that sometime towards the end of March to ensure that we have the results of the IPC in April. Thanks.
And I think the key there is simply the availability of the data to confirm one way or the other whether or not the thresholds have been met. I think the most important takeaway at the moment, however, is that unless WFP and other humanitarian actors are able to scale throughout the remainder of this year, we are facing a catastrophic situation. There's no way to avoid that. And that's why it's essential we have the conflict ending, we have the access, and ultimately we have the humanitarian, but the political response to avoid a return to this situation.
Okay, thank you. Hands up from anyone else online if you have an additional question. I don't see an additional hand up at the moment. Let's see, we'll give it another second. If we're going just to, we put until 2:30, but really I was hoping that we'd wrap it up around 2:15, so we have only about maybe 10 more minutes or so. So if you want to get your question in, please do. There's Tony Brown from BBC. I'm just going to allow your mic and allow your camera. There we go, Tony. Ask away.
Hi all, sorry I'm in the Q&A. Michael mentioned at the top of his statement about something being on the verge of collapse, and I just missed what it was. Is it the country as a whole, or was it
Yeah, no, it was to do with the country itself. If you look at all of the sectors, be it food security, education, health, WASH, all of them are on their knees. If you think about it, 19 million children currently out of school because the schools are closed. In most of the hospitals, healthcare centres, either there's a lack of basic drugs or there's the lack of doctors and nurses because many people who have the availability to leave the country have already done so. Access to clean water, access to, as I said, the food security and the availability of food in markets. So when you put all of these factors together, when I was in Port Sudan, the networks were off for the best part of 10 days. And so that inhibits the ability to do any type of business, transactions, and of course just communicate. So many people are already on the road and moving. So, you know, the Sudan that existed at the beginning of 2023 doesn't exist today. There are large parts of the country that the government doesn't necessarily have control over. And as humanitarians, there are large tracts of the country that we simply cannot access. What we really wanted to achieve today also was to ensure that Sudan gets the attention it deserves. When you consider that we've got Gaza and Ukraine happening as we speak, no one's talking about Sudan, and certainly not talking to the extent that is justified given the size and scale of what is coming down the line. And so that's why we were keen to give this information to you all today. Thanks very much for your attention.
Thanks, Tony. Anyone else on the line? Any of our other journalists have a question? You can pop your hand up. I don't see any other ones in the Q&A, but if I see any of their hands go up, you can ask one of our three directors here. Give it another few seconds. But I think we might be done. All right. I think we're good. Last chance for a question. All right, I think we're good. Okay. All right, well, thank you very much, everybody. In the chat on this, for this Teams event, I'll drop in a link to the video news release that went out yesterday with footage from the crisis and a shot list as well. And then you'll also get a 1080p version of the feed from the camera in here and a Teams recording for the online proportion as well. That'll be available shortly after this. I think we can wrap it up. Thank you again to Michael Dunford, our Regional Director, Eddie Rowe, Country Director for South Sudan, and Marielle McGordy for Country Director for South Sudan. Thank you again. And I think that's it. Just last check here. No, yes, Stephen, you mentioned that was Tony's question that he asked on camera. So I think we're good. All right. Thanks again.
Thanks all.
Thanks,
Greatly appreciated.
Thank you.
Okay, and done.
Excellent. Thank
Thank
you all.
you.
So that was our first press briefing from Brussels, from the office. I think it went all right,
Oh, yeah?
except for the fact that I forgot that Coffee was speaking, and you were the South Sudan director. Besides that, we're open.
I wouldn't mind it now.
What you want to do? Swap?
All things-
You want us to swap? Oh gosh. I've just done with the beardy man. I don't want the other man.
Excellent. No, very good. Thanks a lot.
So I'll let
Thanks a
you
lot,
know,
guys.
on that, and everything was okay on the motor side? Absolutely. Okay, great.
Yeah.
Thanks.
Thanks, guys.
Great. You can leave the hot room now.
Well, it's getting a bit warm. Well done, guys.
Did you notice that we did not focus on funding?
No, I didn't. I keep forgetting it all.
Yeah.
My team killed me, but I just